Testing, 1, 2, we recording, perfect. Okay, so just some administrative stuff to go through before we proceed with today's lecture. Going forward, we're only going to be having one kind of conventional lecture like this each week. The second class, so in your case, I think that's Fridays, is just going to be like a review period, class time for you to practice, work on what we went over in the lecture and apply it towards your assignments. This is because I got a lot of feedback that the first assignment was pretty heavy for a lot of people and just kind of we covered too much content too quick. So that's going to be how we're structuring the class going forward. But also more generally, if you just have any questions you want to ask me, not just about game development, maybe resume writing, career stuff like that. I'm also available during a review period to just answer anything, right? If there's any features in Unreal Engine that you want to learn about, maybe you want to learn AI, animation, that would be a good time to ask those questions. Obviously, with priority being given to those students who need help with class content. Okay. All right, so I believe as of last class, we had kind of a stopwatch, a starting line, and a checkpoint. And we were generating some events off of our checkpoints and our starting line that interacted with our game mode here. If I come to the event graph here, right? And we were using these create event nodes to bind our events. Now, a couple of students in other sections reached out to me and pointed out a mistake that I had made, and that I had two event dispatchers named the same thing on different classes, right? So on the starting line here, we have this event called onLapComplete, and also on our game mode, we have an event dispatcher named onLapComplete. This isn't great. You should ideally avoid having identically named event dispatchers because it can create confusion. Which event dispatcher are you listening to? The one on the starting line or the one on the game mode? There is a lack of clarity here. It's a very good point, right? I don't always name things perfectly the first time. So I'm just going to come in and I'm going to rename this. Right, so on our starting line, it's called onLapCompleted. I'm just going to call this on starting line task. And I'm going to compile. And this way, there's no confusion, right? On our game mode, we have our onLapComplete. And this is actually describing what is actually going on here, is that the starting line is being passed. If I wanted to be really good and really diligent, I would go to my onStartingLine passed event dispatcher here, and I might add an input or a Boolean. Call it lap completed. Now it's going to throw an error. Again, if you remember what we covered last class, this is just a bug. I don't know why it does this. If you want to fix this, you can call a new one, or you can right-click and refresh the node. Basically what happens is you can see here, I changed the name of this parameter, and that caused this node to kind of become out of sync with the C++ definition of this event dispatcher. I don't know why it happens, it just kind of does. We can take our Boolean out of our check if all checkpoints triggered. Call this check lap completion. Actually, I call it that. Check lap completion. Again, just nice, clear naming. And we can add our Boolean in here. Now, if we compile, we may get an error. Yeah, so now it's saying the signature doesn't match on onLapCompleted. So we got to come in here, add a Boolean. Let's call this one success, right? So if a lap is completed, add an if statement, use that Boolean. Does everybody understand what's going on here, right? So we have this lap completion function. It's returning a Boolean. This Boolean is going into the event dispatcher. And then anything that is bound to this event dispatcher, that same value will come out of here, right? So it's going in here and out here, right? And then all we're doing here is just using the Boolean condition to say, well, okay, if we've actually successfully completed a lap, so we're checking to see if we've passed the starting line. And now we're just saying, well, if we've actually successfully completed a lap, then go and do all of the checks that we need to when we complete a lap. This isn't mandatory. If you don't want to do this, you don't have to. It was just pointed out to me by some other students that this was kind of unclear, and they were right. So it seems good to go in and fix it. Okay, we also created this stopwatch blueprint here to record time. And you can see here when we successfully complete a lap, we record the time. We have a couple of arrays of time codes and floats. I don't care which one you use. You can display the time however you like. That is up to you. The important thing is that we are storing an array. And then we have these functions here for printing lap time. And this here, which is really unclearly named because it's saying auto gen func. I believe this is for our race completion. We can say, print all lap times. Okay. And in these, all we're really doing is we're converting the time code into a string and printing it to the log. And this pretty well covers the first assignment, right? If you look at the first assignment, it has really kind of four main expectations of the game mode. The first two expectations are the event dispatcher. So on race complete, on lap complete. And the second two expectations are a way to track the number of laps that have been completed and the total laps required to complete the race. And obviously that logic feeds into when we broadcast these events, right? Any questions about what a game mode is, what an event dispatcher is, why you use them? These are all reasonable questions, right? Does everybody understand why we would use an event dispatcher as opposed to just like getting another object as a variable and communicating with it directly? Precisely, yes. Scalability is a big reason that you would do it, right? Any number of things can subscribe to an event dispatcher, right? If we want to change the music, if we want to play a sound effect, if we want to do a million different things when we complete a lap, all of those things can be kind of encapsulated in their own class. And all they need to do is bind to the event on our game mode, right? So if I go back to my event graph here, right, all we need to do is this. And we don't need to do it on our game mode, and we don't need to do it on our starting line, right? Our music player blueprint, if we ever get to that, right? That's its own thing. It doesn't need to know anything about any other class except the game mode, right? And because the game mode is globally accessible, everything can get the game mode. It is one of the only classes in Unreal Engine that is guaranteed to exist in every single level. It has to exist, right? That's why we do it. And the way that we get our game mode is like this. This is the checkpoint class I did here. We get our game mode, and then we cast to the game mode that we defined. Does everybody understand what casting is? Right? I know you do. Can I get a show of hands if everybody understands what casting is and why we cast. Okay. So casting is another way of getting blueprints, getting objects to communicate with one another. Right, so everybody understands object-oriented programming, the concept of inheritance, right? You have a high-level object here. In this case, this would be our game mode base. This is like the base class of all of our game modes, right? And the game mode we created is a child class. So this is our racing game mode, right? What casting is, so our get game mode here, this node, doesn't know what type of game mode we're getting, right? It's just getting the highest level, most generic game mode, because that function can be called on every single class in every single level in every single game that is created, right? So that's returning an object of that type, right? What casting is doing is it's saying, hey, this high level type doesn't have all of the information that we need to access. All of the stuff like our event dispatchers, our variables, everything is defined on this child class. What casting does is it says, take this and treat it as though it is a class of that type, right? Treat it as though it is our race game mode. Now, whenever you cast, like let's say we're creating a completely different kind of game and we don't have this game mode in our level, if we say cast to this, treat it as though it's this kind, and let's say we create another one here that's like a time trial game mode, right? It's a very common other game mode you'd see in a racing game. And we say, well, treat it as though it's our race game mode, but it's not, it's our time trial game mode. It's going to fail, right? That's where we have this other pin here where it says cast failed. It's going to say we can't do that. We can't treat it as though it is of this type because the object is in fact of this type. Cast failed. Okay. And casts have two outputs, right? So we have these two execution pins. So failure and success. And then it returns an object reference to our game mode, right? So if we hover over this, it'll show the return type. It just says game mode base object reference. It's the most generic high level version of our game mode. But if we hover over this, you can see it says as BP race game mode FS2. And this is a race game mode object reference, right? So if you want to do stuff with this, you can convert that. A very common thing that I will do if I know that I'm going to be referencing my game mode a lot is I'll just do this and convert that to a variable and store it as a variable for easy access later down the line. Probably not really worth it in this case because we're just binding a single event, but that's what casting is. It's important to understand casting kind of generally for you guys, right? You guys might not go into game development, and that's okay. But casting is something that you will encounter in other programming languages, right? In C#, often, I believe like the default syntax is like, you'll see it in variable in brackets like this. This would be like VP race game mode, get game mode. This, a lot of frameworks will also frame it as implicit functions. So it would be like get game mode, or not implicit, but rather generic functions, right? And then you would put something like that. It might look like this. If we were writing this in code, depending on the framework that we were using, right? Generic. I know in C#, in Unity, it uses generics a lot of the time. You'll often see syntax like this, which is saying, get our game mode. We don't know, like this function doesn't know what type of game mode it is. So tell it what type of game mode it is, right? Bottom line, casting, take a parent class, turn it into a child class. We don't, like, again, because our parent class doesn't necessarily know what the child class is, there's a possibility of failure here. So account for that possibility of failure. Right? We might want to put debug message here. Say error. Game mode is of incorrect type. Please use BP_race game mode. Right? And we can make the color red. I like a good red error message. Make it last a million seconds. The reason I'm making it last so long is because if we've tried to cast to our race game mode and we failed, there is no way that our race is going to work. Like the rules of our game can't work. Our checkpoint is not going to work as intended. Our game might not crash, but it's not going to work. And when your game is functioning, like it's not crashing, but it's also not working, that is the most difficult time to debug, right? Because you're not going to be given an error message. It's not going to say, hey, here's what's going wrong. You're missing a semicolon here. When the program is working, but it's not doing what you want, that is the worst place to be as a programmer, right? Because where do you even start? Where do you start to look for what's going wrong? A good habit to get into is if there is a point of failure, especially one where human error is involved, right? You forgot to toggle something. You set the variable to be of the wrong type. And it's going to prevent your game from working, prevent your program, your database search, your dating app. I don't care what you're working on. Have a little bit message in the log saying, hey, here's what you're doing wrong. Here's how you fix it, right? I'm not evaluating you on whether you do this, but it is a very good habit to get into as a programmer. Okay. All right. So that's just like a very quick review of what we've covered over the past couple of weeks. Obviously, the lectures are recorded. You can go and watch those on your own time. And again, if you would like to review anything, go through any of the functions that we've created. Next class, we have an hour and a half that is just dedicated to questions and answers. Okay. All right. So we have our timer. We have our starting lines. We have our ability to track the player's completion of laps. We're pretty much done the second assignment at this point. I'm going to show you how to start creating the third assignment, which is a user interface. I'm going to open up D2L here, and we're just going to review the assignment, just so we make sure that we are 100% on the same page. And of course, it's going to ask me for two-factor authentication. Okay. Your thing here, I'll view it as a student. And you can see all of your upcoming assignments. So your second assignment is due March 7th. So you have about a month to do it. And we've already covered all of it in our lectures. Again, I strongly recommend you do it before reading week. If you're done by the start of reading week, that gives you like 2 weeks of grace period to figure out any GitHub issues you're having, stuff like that. It's always nice. It's a good feeling to be done ahead of time and to be confident that you're ready to move on. Okay. I'm just going to review this real quickly and just show you that we've done everything, like set the total number of laps in the race, track how many laps the player has completed, and then broadcast these events, right? Voila. So if you've done this, you can even get started on your third assignment, which is to build a user interface, right? So building on your previous assignment, you will create a user interface to display information to the player. It should display the following information: an up-to-date time on the timer we created, the recorded time of the previous lap. So, when they complete a lap, how fast did they do it? how many laps the player needs to complete to finish the race. And, this is not optional. The player's current speed is optional. You don't have to display that if you don't want to. I'll make a note to update this. Yeah, okay. And here we have a link that is really helpful. Where I can look at the game user interface database here, right? So this is just a huge database of all kinds of different games. In my case, I have it set up to take you directly to the racing game. The filter is already set up. But this is just something that you can use for inspiration, right? So I can come here, all right, here's a cool looking racing game. Maybe you like the color palette. Yeah, you can say, all right, here's our HUD, right? Showing the speed, showing the total number of laps needed to complete, shows the time over here, as well as like this, the time in seconds. And you can just kind of go through all of these different racing games and pick aspects that you like and say, here's what I want to do. This is a cool layout. This is a cool color scheme. This is what I want to use, right? If you just grab one of these and copy it, I don't really care. You're allowed to do that. There's an expression, there's only so many ways to skin a cat, which just means that like, if a user interface if you're doing a user interface for a racing game, there's only so many ways you can do it, right? And odds are somebody else at some point has done it. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you're less original or that you're plagiarizing. It just means you're taking inspiration from something else. You're allowed to do that. Okay. So this is where I would start. I'm also just going to double check and come on now. Make sure that your assignment is up to date real quick, because that is not up to date. Move FS1. I showed this to previous class, and theirs was, yeah, here we go. I'm just going to update this right now so I don't forget. I want to make sure that you guys have. This just offers more guidance. Just going to copy that, go over to your section and update your assessments. My apologies. That's the wrong one. Okay, just updated that. Okay. I'm just going to make sure that this is nice and clear. Okay, yeah. Because the first part of the assignment is also another design document, which is basically just create a wireframe, do a quick sketch. If you want to pick a color palette, just kind of detail what you want to build and how you want to build it, right? This is also a really good habit to get into, because very often when you're working in an industry, let's say you're doing front-end development for a website, your boss isn't going to just be like, all right, go nuts, show me what you come up with in 3 weeks. They're going to be like, no, like, show me a sketch in a couple of days so I can make sure that what you will be working on is what fits with our project, right? This is just a good habit to get into before you jump into implementation. Just like sketch it out and do a little write-up saying, here's why I like this, here's why I think this is a good idea, here's why I think it's going to work. I'm not evaluating the aesthetic quality of your user interface. You could make the ugliest user interface on the planet. You could use purple and green and brown for your color scheme. It could be hideous, but as long as I can see that you at least thought through it and said, here's why I think this is a good idea, I don't especially care. It's mostly about coming up with an idea, standing by it, and kind of arguing for that idea. You're pitching your idea at this point, right? As far as implementation, let's say you get really ambitious and have like a really beautiful user interface designed and you struggle to actually implement it in Unreal Engine. Don't worry. Like the implementation side is just an evaluation of your code, right? Are you following best practices? Does it work? If it doesn't look exactly like you want it to in Unreal Engine, that's okay. I even specifically say here, you can just use like the common components provided by Unreal Engine, or you can import your own textures and stuff. It's not expected, right? So if you want to really get into it and figure out user interfaces, be my guest. I encourage you to do so. Not expected, right? And also here, there's just like some code guidelines for this is called UMG. It's just their user interface for best practices. So if ever you're having any issues being like, my user interface is blurry, it's not scaling correctly, it's not laid out correctly, come to this and it will show you how to best use your user interface, right? I won't go into that in too much detail right now. I'm just going to do like a kind of hello world quick start for our user interface for you guys now, right? So here we have our blueprints folder. We need to create our user interface. And to do that, I'm going to right click. Again, we have all of the different stuff we can create. Unfortunately, user interfaces are not a basic asset. We can come all the way down to the bottom here where it says user interface. And here we have this thing called a widget blueprint, right? Widget blueprint. And if you hover over it, it sees what it does. The widget blueprint enables extending user widget, the user extensible widget. It's unfortunately not very helpful. It's not very descriptive. Just know that a widget blueprint is how we build and design our user interfaces, right? And just select user widget from that dropdown. There's only one class you can inherit from in this case. And I'm going to call this WBP, right? Widget blueprint, just to distinguish it from all of the other blueprints that we're making. I'm going to call this racing UI. Call it racing HUD, racing whatever, player HUD, assignment 3 HUD, as long as it's clear and I know what it is and I can tell that that's what you want me to grade. Okay. And if you double click and open it up, it'll take us here. And this should look fairly familiar, like it's a grid. But unlike the other blueprints, if I right click, nothing really happens. There's no menu. And that's because this grid is going to be used to lay out and design our user interface. Okay. On the left-hand side here, you see we have a palette, right? And in this palette, we have all kinds of different user interface elements. So we have like a border, a button, checkboxes, progress bars, sliders. You guys have done a little bit of like front-end web development, I'm guessing. Did you use like, was it Node.js or something like that? So I'm pretty sure Node.js also provides a whole bunch of kind of components that are prepackaged for you to use, right? So this is the same thing. These are just all of the different components that Unreal Engine provides to build your user interface. The first one we're going to pull in is this thing here. So in the panel, this would be like, I don't know, like horizontal boxes, containers. I don't know, what's the like the default container in Node.js? Is it like a box component or something? You want to lay things out, basically.
Stuff we use in CSS, the Flexbox, I think.
Flexbox. Your canvas panel is your Flexbox, right? If I drag this in, you can see now I have a box that matches the aspect ratio of my screen, right? So in this case, it's 16 by 9, right? Right, and here on the bottom, we can see our hierarchy here. We have our canvas panel right here. In the details panel, you can see all of the information about this canvas panel, including its name right here at the top. So canvas panel 25, not super descriptive. I'm just going to call this background canvas, right? This is like the background. It's like our screen. This is how we're going to lay things out. gonna go look at my Game UI database again. I think I liked, which one was the good one? This one here. I liked this one. Right? We go down to our racing kind of gameplay overlays here. I'll look at this. Okay, so let's start with our lap position right here. Right, so we can see that it shows us the lap that we're on, as well as the total number of laps we need to complete, and labels it with lap. If I zoom in, I can't zoom in, plain, okay. So let's start just by adding some text to our user interface, right? I'm gonna search for text. You can see in the common, we have this text block here. There's also a rich text block, which you are probably more familiar with than I am, having done CSS. I believe you should be familiar with like rich text syntax. I don't really know how to use it, but if you want to use it and apply your like front end development to that, be my guest. Okay. And you can see I just clicked and dragged my text from here into my palette, right? And by default, it's called text block _0. Let's call this lap counter. Good idea to just name things what they are so that they're easy to find, right? And you can see I have my position X. I can modify it here, or I can just click and drag it wherever I want to. My position Y. And up here, we have our anchors. And this is just saying, like, when we define our position, it is relative to this position on our screen, right? So if I want it to be relative to the top left corner, then I would select this anchor, relative to the left, relative to the entire screen. We can do it that way as well. Yeah. So I'll just kind of position it for now. Generally, when I'm blocking out a user interface, I'm not super disciplined. I'll kind of go back in and clean it up later once I'm sure that it looks good and it does what I want. Then I'll go in and make sure that it's laid out a little bit better. So we want this to display the number of laps. You can see I can set the text here. So we want this to display the number of laps. If I go back here, okay, it looks like it's white text with like a blue outline. We can set the appearance of our text here. So just like everything else, you have this details panel on the right-hand side. Anytime you create an element, you drag it and drop it in there, select it, you can modify it using the details panel, right? So the text color seems fine. Here I can add an outline. That's pretty handy. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more here. All right, so that's about right. Can change the outline color. It's like a kind of a neutral navy blue, kind of like this. Might even make it a little bit bigger. The outline of like 2. Okay. You can skew. It was a little bit skewed, not a whole amount, not a whole lot, right? A little bit, but not too much. It's a little bit too much. I'd say it was like maybe like 0.15, so like 15% skew, like so. And then you can increase the size to whatever you need it to be. That looks about right. Okay. Here I have our lap counter. Now we need to display some information that is stored in our game mode, right? So we now have in our game mode the total laps needed to complete the race, as well as the total number of laps the player has completed. So we need to get this information and kind of pipe it into our user interface somehow. And the way we could do this, like we could go into our actual, like we have a blueprint graph for this as well. If I click on graph here, you can see we can add functions and all kinds of programming logic to our user interface. We could go onto our tick here, get our game mode, and just like every frame update the user interface. That's a bit complicated. I don't like doing it that way because there's an easy way. So the way I switch between my blueprint graph and like my user interface designer is just these 2 buttons here on the top right. I'm designing my user interface. I'm programming my user interface. Signing, programming, okay? There we go. We have our lap counter. We have our text. We have this drop down here where it says bind, right? We can bind the content, this variable, to another variable. So if I click this drop down, I see this little plus button here that says create binding. I'm going to click on it. You'll see here, it takes me to a function. So we're back in our graph up at the top here. You can see we've defined this function that's called get lap counter text. If you don't name your stuff coherently, these functions will have just the most nonsensical names. It'll be like get text underscore 0 underscore text. Tells me nothing about what it does. This is pretty reasonable. Get lap counter text. I'll leave it like that for now. Right. So just like our checkpoint, we can get our game mode. Everything can get our game mode. That is why we store kind of the rules of our game, high level information in our game mode. Right click, open up our function menu, get game mode. Here's our game mode. Who remembers what we need to do to treat this as though it is our racing game mode? Starts with a C. Casting, thank you. We're going to cast to BP underscore race game mode. In my case, it's called underscore FS2. Right, here we have our race game mode. We can get the laps completed. We can get laps to complete race, total laps to win. Here, we can get our variables. Now, we need to somehow format these integers into a text type. I'm going to show you the quick and easy way to do it. You can right-click and search for append string. Append string. You can hover over it, and you can see it says concatenates two strings together to make a new string. I believe you can also just type in consat, and it'll take you also here to append, right? And here we have multiple string inputs. We can add more to make our string larger. And to remove pins, you right-click and say remove pin. I'm going to plug laps completed into the first one. And the second one, I'm just going to type a slash. I'll put the total laps needed to win here in the second one. And then out of this string, I'll plug it in here. And you can see if this requires a text output. For most basic variable types, you can just click and drag and it'll automatically convert it for you. If you're curious about the difference between text and a string, it's basically text you can localize. So you have like a localization table. So if you want to sell your game in Quebec and need to translate it into French, you would need to use text because it will like automatically translate based on what localization table you're using. In case you were curious, strings are, well, just that. They're strings. They're arrays of characters. Okay, so I've created my user interface, but if I press play, right, I'm gonna grab my boost pad and just get rid of that real quickly because for some reason it is not compiling. I'll go to my world settings, make sure I'm just using my default colors. That should work fine. Okay, we don't actually see our user interface right now. So we need to create and display our user interface. We could do this on our cart. If we wanted to just like go to the template, blueprints, open up our cart, we could do it there. But we can also do it on our game mode. It makes sense to do it on our game mode because, well, the user interface we're building is tied to our game mode. And also, again, we are 100% certain that our game mode is going to exist. Right? I'm going to go back to my game mode here. I'm going to clean this up a little bit. Just going to move this up here. I'm going to right click and create a sequence node. sequence. So first, we're going to bind all of our events. To create a comment, I select all the nodes I want to include in a box and press C for comment. And you can see I can just describe what this big group of nodes is doing. Bind events. Make the text bigger, change the color of the box, make it red. Bind events. And here, we're going to create our user interface. Create widget. That's the function used to build a user interface. Create widget. You can see we have this class dropdown. So here we're going to select WBP underscore racing UI. I believe this is the one we just created. I'm just going to add a little suffix to this to make sure I'm using the one for your section. FS2. Okay, now we're creating our user interface. We have this owning player input as well. You don't really have to worry too much about this just because we're doing a single player game. If we were doing a multiplayer game, you would have to make sure that you like assign which player gets the user interface. But don't worry about this input. Now, if I press play, we're still not going to see our user interface. Still no good. And that's because we built it, we've created an object. Now we need to tell this object to display itself on our screen. We can do that by saying add to viewport or add to player screen, either works. Again, this is a difference for multiplayer, right? Add to player screen. If we had like a split screen game, like if you've ever played local multiplayer, you have 4 people sitting on a couch, each has a controller, right? Here's your screen, and the screen gets split like this, and like player 1, 2, 3, 4. Add to player screen, we'll just add it to like the section, whereas add to viewport, we'll add it to the entire screen. For your purposes, doesn't make a difference, but in case you're curious, we're going to add it to our viewport. And now we should see our user interface. There it is. Right. Now in our case, there's a bit of debugging that needs to happen because it's saying 0 out of 2. Obviously, we go again, look back at our reference. We don't necessarily want to display the number of laps that have been completed, but like the lap that the player is actually on right now. What is the lap in progress? So it'll always be the total number of laps completed plus 1, right? Because if they've completed 2 laps, then they are on their 3rd lap. If they've completed 1 lap, they are on their 2nd lap. If they've completed 0 laps, they are on their 1st lap. So to do this, I can go back into my function here. So I just opened up my racing UI. We have our function to get lap counter text. And for laps completed, I just type in plus to add. I will add 1. Now you can see we're on lap 1 of 2. Assuming everything still works. Now I'm on lap 2 of 2. Right, you can see it updated automatically. That is the benefit of using a binding function here. If I go into my designer, you can see we've assigned it this function. Basically what it's saying is set this property on our user interface element to whatever the output of this function is at any given time. And it will update all the time. So if you want up-to-date information, for example, what lap the player is on, all of that, you can do it this way. Okay, let's go back to our reference here. All right, there's this other little text thing here. It seems to be smaller text, and the color scheme is inverted. That just says lap. So let's add this. Right, so here we're back in our widget blueprint, our designer. I'm going to drag another text element in. Say, call it lap. Now, it would be nice if I could make sure that these are like perfectly vertical and flush to one another at all times. The way I do that is using another type of container. Here in the panels, here we have this vertical box. Right, if you hover over it, it tells you what it does. Vertical box widget is a layout panel allowing child widgets to be automatically laid out. I'm going to drag my vertical box in here. You can see now I have my vertical box. I can click and drag these. Normally I can just click and drag them onto the vertical box. We'll see. Doesn't seem to want to let me this time. If ever it's not working for some reason, you can come here into your hierarchy, right? We want to make these two text elements children of this vertical box. I'm going to grab my lap and my lap counter. I'm going to click and just drag them onto my vertical box, and you can see the little check mark saying, hey, yes, you can do this. Now you can see they're both laid out perfectly vertically. There is a difference now though, right? Whereas before we had the ability to choose how they were anchored in like the overall space, now we can only choose how they are aligned in the vertical box. So in my case, I want to make sure that this lap counter is always aligned to the left horizontally. And just unfortunately for this, I don't have like a golden rule on how to like pick the alignment in auto versus fill. The truth is, I just kind of wing it and select the buttons and change them until I get the look that I want. The main difference is auto only gets as much room as it needs, whereas fill will fill as much as it possibly can. So if I go here, you can see vertical alignment, right? It's going to fill everything vertically. But if it's set to auto, it's only going to take as much vertical space as it needs. But if I say fill, now you can see it's kind of pushing everything else down because it's taking as much space as it can. If I do the same thing with my lap counter, it also tries to take as much space as it possibly can. Right? Most of the time, I just use, like for something like this, I just use auto because again, I look at my reference, they're pretty close to one another, so that's good. Okay, I believe this outline color was white and a little bit bigger, a little too much. The size was a little bit smaller than our lap counter, but not so much smaller. And the text color was, again, just kind of deep navy, like so. And it was a little bit skewed. And unfortunately, this is not in the right position anymore. But conveniently, to reposition both of these, all we need to do is reposition our vertical box. Right? We have our vertical box, and we can now click. Fortunately, a little bit tricky to click and drag it in the scene like so. Come on, there we go. You can click and drag your vertical box around. It's a little bit easier once you start getting into containers to set it using the settings here. You can technically click and drag it around, but it's kind of tricky. Oops. Okay, so I'm just going to set this using my settings here. So it's kind of close to the center of the left-hand screen, and it's left-hand side of the screen, and it's just kind of offset a little bit like so. If I were to actually build this, I would probably have like a vertical box for the mini map, the lap, and the position. And inside that vertical box, I would have two more vertical boxes inside of a horizontal box. You can see you can kind of like nest all of the different elements to get the layout you want. Not super worried about that just yet. So I'm going to set the anchor to be the middle left-hand side of the screen, because that's kind of the closest point of the screen that this user interface is. I'm just going to zero out its position for now. So I'm going to set its position X to 0, its position Y to 0. And that is a good opportunity to show you alignment as well. You can see by default, it aligns to the top left-hand side of the container. If I wanted to say align it to the middle of the container, you can change the alignment. This alignment is a percentage, right? So 0.5 it'll be aligned halfway up the y-axis. If I set this to 1, it'll be aligned 100% along the y-axis. And same thing with the x-axis. If I set this to like 0.5, you can see it's halfway along the x-axis. 1 is 100% along the x-axis. So if you wanted to align it to the center, we could put 0.5 in both. Yeah, for the most part, I think you can probably get by with 0 and 0. And I'm just going to kind of nudge it to the direction that I want, like so. That's kind of where it was, more or less. Right. Hope that makes sense. All right, now we have our lap and our lap counter. We have this kind of timer up at the top of our screen as well. That is like this, again, more text. Let's add that in as well. I'm going to come into my palette and grab a text one here. Now this one is a lot bigger, and it's also aligned to kind of the top center of our screen. See, right? So I'm going to go to my anchor, pick the top center of our screen. I'll zero out my position. Now in this case, our alignment matters quite a bit, right? Because if we go in here, this text is centered, right? So we don't want this text to be kind of over here on the right-hand side as it goes up. So to do that, I'm going to go to my X, and I believe it is 0. Oh no, that's, yeah, that should do it. 0.5, right? Now you can see it's centered to the top center of the screen. This is how you make sure that your user interface elements are aligned perfectly and accurately. You choose an anchor, zero out their position, align it, and then you go in and mess with the position to control the offset from their anchor. Okay. I have an issue here. I'm going to set this to be nice and big, but as I increase the size, the text is anchored to the top left corner as well. So let's go see if we can change the text's alignment. Here you can see this is a text element, justification. You've all used Microsoft Word at some point. You understand what justification is. You can center it. Now our text is centered. This isn't necessary to increase the scale, but you can if you want. You could have the size set to like 0 and 0. And position 0. The reason I tend not to increase the size manually is because for some reason it also offsets the position, which is really annoying. But if you go in and increase the size and you're like, why is it offset? Just know that messing around with the size also messes with the position. And you can just zero it out again. And here it is. Now this is again like a kind of golden yellow with the same dark blue outline. So I can go in and set the text here, golden yellow, and it is a dark blue outline. And let's skew it a little bit. So now we want to get kind of like a flat integer that is the total number of seconds that the player has been in the race. And create another binding. Right? And you can see it's just named get text. It's because we didn't name this thing. Let's just call this our seconds timer. And here we'll say get seconds timer text. Again, we get our game mode. That's where our timer is. You cast to BP underscore race game mode. Now I want this to just be a little bit cleaner. I don't want to plug this into the exec pin if I can avoid it. If you'd like to avoid doing that, you can right click and say convert to pure cast. And you can see now all it does is return the object without needing to be plugged in to this white wire here. Okay. In pure cast, you need to plug it into the execution, this white pin here. Pure cast, you don't need to. This is just returning the object. And what did we call our, so we don't have a variable in here, but we can get our stopwatch component, right? So we can get BP stopwatch. So we're getting the component on our game mode as a variable. I believe our stopwatch component had a total time in seconds. So I can go back here and say get total time seconds. Now, yeah, so this is just displaying an integer. So we need to convert this float to an integer. To do that, we truncate, or alternatively, I think we can just say like convert maybe, convert to float. Yeah, here you can see math conversions to integer 64. Truncate also does the same thing. It rounds towards 0. So if it's like, 6.7 seconds, it'll just display 6. And it'll only display 7 once it goes above 7. Whereas converting, I believe, rounds in the typical way, where if it's 0.5 or above, it'll go up. 0.5 or below, or 0.49 and below, it'll round down. We can truncate this and plug that into our text, and let's see what happens. Now we have a little timer displaying how long the player has been in the race thus far. Any questions about what we've just covered, right? So display, got a little lap counter display here, as well as a timer. Now, our reference also has these, the best, in this case, a record time. So that's not an expectation of this assignment. If you want to figure out how to save the player's best time and compare it, you can do that. Otherwise, you see it has an array of times for each lap. And it has the speed down here. Again, this is optional. You can learn a bit of math on your own, or you come into the review period and ask me questions about how to do that if you want. Any questions about user interfaces, about the expectations of the assignment, about how to create a widget blueprint, lay things out? Laying things out like this, I think should be fairly familiar to you from your front-end development, like CSS and stuff. You have anchors and you position things relative to the anchors, right? I'm not a front-end dev. I'm just kind of riffing, I'm guessing. Yeah.
You have like, kind of custom pictures, or if you're trying to make your own custom stuff and you want to put in images.
Great question. So you do that by importing a texture. In terms of how to create them, you can create textures, and textures are just like JPEGs, PNGs, Targas. If you want to import them, you can just click and drag them into your content browser from your file explorer. Has everybody here used Figma before? Figma? It's what I use to do like 90% of my UI mockups. I believe this was an example from a game jam I did, if it wants to load. This is an example from a game jam game I made a year ago. Does not seem to want to load. Come on now. Yeah, okay. So Figma, you can use Figma to create user interface elements like this. This was just like a mock-up I made. The premise of this game is everyone has done Where's Waldo. If you've ever played those games, is you're given kind of this is the idea of this game, you were given kind of 3 elements to look for out of a crowd. The idea being that you were like a police sniper and you had to like pick them out. And the crowd, there was a timer up at the top that counted down, so you had like 10 seconds to find them. And every time you were successful, the game restarted with more people in the crowd, right? So the crowd kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until, you know, good luck finding the person in the crowd, and however many rounds you completed was your top score. That was the idea of this game. But you can see you can create user interface elements here by, so this clock, for example, is one that I whipped up just by combining different shapes into the shapes that you want, right? So here, this was just like an ellipse and 2 rectangles that I Booleaned together and added a stroke to, right? And if you want to export these user interface elements as a PNG, so I'll just import this clock as an example, right? You can come down here to where it says export. So you select the element that you want to export. You come down here to export. And you can see you can export a PNG and you can set its export scale. And you can preview it here. The checkered grid means that it has a transparent background. That's what you want. You want your like the user interface element to have this checkered background. If this is any other color, it'll automatically like fill your background with that color and you don't want it, right? And then I can just export this here, export clock body. You can see that it's just downloaded it here called clockbody.png. And I'm just going to double check the size on this and make sure that it's not like silly small. I think it is. Details like 80 by 97 pixels. That's a little bit small in my view. So I'm just going to increase the thing to like 4 times and I'll export it again. A good habit to get into if you're just making individual elements is make like the canvas size square. So like 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024. When we get into making materials, I'll go more into like how textures work in Unreal Engine, because there's just a lot going on in the background with that, but I'll show you just how to quickly import textures now. I'm going to create a new folder, just to keep things organized, and I'll call this textures. And I'm going to open up my file explorer here. So here I have my downloads file explorer. I can just click and drag into my content browser. Now you can see I have this clock body here. It looks like I forgot to select the arms. I'm not going to worry about that for now. The point is, you know how to import textures at this point. Once you've done it, if you're doing it specifically for user interfaces, we have this thing called a texture group. Select UI. This is basically like a whole bunch of presets that you can do. So you can have it be like a character or a weapon UI. It's a user interface texture. sRGB can probably be true unless you're doing something really special with materials. You can leave it at sRGB. X-axis and Y-axis tiling method. Also probably not super relevant. What wrap means is, let's say we have a square that we want to put our image in, and we put our clock in this, and then we offset our texture, like we move it to the left or the right. What will happen is it'll tile like this. We'll get more into that with materials, but you can probably just leave it at default. But if you want to offset it and it's giving you a hard time, you can just go here and say clamp instead. It'll only tile once. You can go in and adjust it. You can change the brightness, saturation, all of that. Broadly speaking, you should probably do this in Figma, just because these adjustments are not great in Unreal Engine. It's not meant to be an image editor, but you can if you need to. There are a couple other things. I'll have to remember exactly what settings there are, particularly with power of two mode as well as MIP filtering. Like, so this filter here, you can leave it at default from texture group usually. That's why you set the texture group to UI, is it will automatically set like the more complex stuff. Okay, so we have this image here. Here's our clock body. It's going to close down everything else except this and my user interface. I have my user interface here. Let's say I want to put this clock body next to my timer to show what it is, right? Up at the top here, we have an image component here. This image widget allows you to display a slate brush or texture or material in the user interface. Here we have our image. I'm going to put it into a horizontal block, horizontal box so that it's flush with this text box. I'll grab my horizontal box here. I'll grab my image, throw it in here. Obviously, this is kind of in the wrong order. So to move the orientation or the position of things in your layout boxes, you can click on these arrows and it'll do that. I'm going to grab my horizontal box again, just kind of anchor it there, get it back into position. This is the x-axis. I'll move it, just kind of increase the size, move it down. So just that size to something like this. With my text block, I will align it that side, fill. Now we have our image here. In our brush here, we have this drop down here where you can select, you can apply a material to it. I'll go more into user interface materials when I get into actual materials, but you can also see you can select textures. So I believe this one was called clock body. So clock body texture. I can select it. You can see that it's displaying it, but it's not quite the size that we want. So you can change it here to display it as either a border, a rounded box, or a box. I'm going to just keep it on image. On our image size, you can kind of increase it, but it will not, typically will not go past the bounds of its container. I click fill, you can see now it looks a little goofy. Keeping it on auto. And it also looks kind of goofy. There we go. Something like that. And then if we go to our horizontal box, we can just kind of scale it down to get the image size we want. There is an option, I forget exactly what it is. It's been a hot minute since I've done user interface materials where you can like maintain the, what do you call it? The aspect ratio of your image. I don't remember exactly how to do it. So usually what I'll do is in the image size, I can just come in here to my clock body and you can see up at the top here, it shows the imported texture resolution. You can just match it to the texture resolution and then just scale it up and down relative to those dimensions. This is typically why I recommend all textures be square and a power of 2. So, 16 by 16 or 32 by 32, 64 by 64, 128 by 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096. It's a lot easier to manage that way. So I'll just set this to 320 by 388. So 320 by 388. And I believe down here, yeah, you can just like scale it. Okay, so I'm just going to scale this down by like 0.5 and 0.5. Oh. And just kind of nudge your vertical box to give it the room that it needs. And in my case, the issue is that it's filling here. So it'll stretch the texture to fill. So this is where understanding alignment is important. I'm just going to center it out like so. Now if oh, it's still stretching. Come on now, auto, there we go. Why is it doing that? Set to be vertical and horizontal and auto, so it shouldn't be stretching to fill the entire thing. Question of the day, this is happening. Fill, auto, vertically, line vertically, 320 by 388. It could be, yeah, I'd wager that it's just trying to like get up to 388 and scale down. I will prepare something more in depth on how to do this. Oh, that's why scale Y is still set to 1. There we go. I can prepare something more in depth for next class on how to do this, on how to do images. I'll do that because this is something, again, user interfaces are not really my strong suit. I can stumble my way through it, but I kind of just figure them out as I go, as you can see. But that's how you would import an image. You would use an image generator like Figma, Photoshop, Adobe XD. I don't really like, it doesn't really matter what you use. I like Figma because it scales, right? It generates vector images so that you can scale it to whatever resolution you need. I'll show you some other, let's see what other examples I have. Files. That was one. What's nice about Figma as well is it offers like big libraries of these kinds of icons. Totally legit to use them if you want to use them that way. Like here's a UI mockup I did. And you can see that I created the buttons and then I can export these buttons as images and import them. This was for like a nature photography game that I worked on for a little bit. Yeah. And this is nice too, because it actually, as you're building it in Figma, if you're familiar enough with whatever DCC, that's short for digital content creation application that you're using, you can kind of do whatever you want in this. So in my case, like I applied a bit of vignetting around the edges, created the buttons, set the colors. I knew I wanted rounded borders on the buttons because I was trying to mimic the user interface of like a DSLR camera, right? I can do it really quickly and just like mock it up and determine whether or not it's worth pursuing and spending the time to build an Unreal Engine first, right? Again, I don't expect you to do this. It's not really, it's kind of outside the scope of this course, but you can if you want to. If ever you go above and beyond, I will never punish you for doing so, okay? But this is how you would create user interface elements. You'd select the element you created. So I created this button. I could come down here and export it. Export it as a PNG. If you export it as a JPEG, JPEGs don't support transparency. So basically what that means is if I had exported this clock, for example, as a JPEG, I wouldn't be able to see through the background. It would just be like a white box. Okay. So it has to be either a PNG. I don't think Figma supports Targas. You can use PNGs, Targas, which are just like a super old school image format that's used a lot specifically in game development. Don't ask me why, but they just use Targas. But if I press play here, now you can see we've got our little clock here on the side too. I'll do a bit of research and have some stuff prepared for you for Friday. Yeah. Cool. Well, that's class today, guys. Thank you all for coming in. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your week. If you want help, come in on Friday. If not, Friday is yours to do with what you want. And yeah.
I know, I got to run the class.
Watch out, the table is broken. Just put it on the desk.